Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Tanner. I teach 10th and 11th grade English here at AHS, and today we want to spend some time in advisory talking to you about a new way to read, or maybe not a new way, but a way to help you read more effectively. So what we want to teach you about today is a strategy called close reading, and it really is just what it sounds like. It's teaching you how to look at a text and let it speak for itself. So first, let's just give a little bit of an overview of what close reading is. We're looking at exploring short passages. We're not asking you to read an entire novel closely or even a whole chapter. We're looking at short text and then asking you to focus on many different features about a text. So more than just what's happening, but how did the author do that? What are the words that he used? What are the structures that he used? How did he put it all together? How did the author create meaning for us as far as big life lessons like theme? And how does this connect with what I've learned in the past? And how does it connect with who I am as a person? What's the purpose? Well, in addition to what we've already talked about, one purpose is to help you be a more independent reader so that when you leave here, you feel more confident and more able to deal with any kind of text that you might see in a college setting or in the workplace. We want you to do so independently, and we think that this strategy will give you the skills to do that. So as I mentioned, some of the key components involve really you thinking of yourself as a detective, or even, not to be cheesy, but as a treasure hunter. You're looking into text deeply. It's going to involve becoming familiar with the text, which is going to require you taking a look at it more than once. When we do a close read, we really just want the text itself to be your clue. What does the text say? We do also want you to read with a pencil because we want you to notice different pieces, and we want you to circle them and underline. And if you're familiar with this term, we want you to annotate the text, which really just means to mark it up as you read and as you discover the different pieces that the author's trying to communicate. And then again, eventually, we want you to discuss the text and ultimately write about the text. So hopefully you can hear us in that. You can hear the idea being that we want you to be able to make meaning independently, discuss it in a collaborative way, and then write about it. We really feel like that is such an important skill set for you, not only here, but as you leave us. Let's take a look at an example. You might be reading a text that's dealing with World War II, and you might be really tempted to just say, oh, I can connect to that. My grandfather fought in World War II. And that would be an important text to self-connection. But what close reading is going to ask you to do is to go a little bit more deeply than that and really stay focused not so much on your experience, but on what the text says. And so maybe what you would do with that instead would be something to say, you know what, I remember my grandfather talking about similar struggles to the ones that are here in the text. Do you see what happened there? You focused on the text itself and the struggles that came out of it, and then you connected loosely to your grandfather, but you didn't make the connection to your granddad the most important piece. So you were still able to make the so what connection, but not just broadly about war or World War II, but about that struggle that this character in this text is experiencing. Hopefully you see the difference there. That to become familiar with your text, you need to read it more than one time. Think about this in life. To become familiar with any person, you want to spend more than just 5 minutes with him. You want to meet him more than once. The same is true when we read. You're going to spend more than just a few quick minutes with this text. You're not going to read closely for every single text that you ever study. Just some that you think might benefit from a deeper look. 3 areas that we'll look for. We're going to call them the observe, interpret, or apply or ask. Another way to think about that would be the what, the how, and the why or so what. So we're going to actually give you some practice with this using your summer reading book. We want to bring that back to us and kind of talk through how Jack Gantos features some important ideas that we could explore more closely than maybe we did the first time we read it. So let's take a look together as a whole school at page 39 of A Hole in My Life. Now, your advisory teacher right now is going to pass out some handouts that have this passage on there, and you're welcome to annotate as we mentioned a few minutes ago. Okay, so this first read, I'm actually going to read the passage to you. And I want you to think through these questions as far as the what. What is the text about? Okay, here we go. We're on page 39, the beginning of chapter 4. Let's read together. Like every guy, I had read On the Road by Kerouac and wanted to cut loose and carom from coast to coast as he did without thinking of money or trouble or anything but the great freedom that awaited me like a ship heading to sea. I was looking for a change. I wanted to see something beyond high school and the King's Court and a grocery store aisle lined with canned vegetables. And I was especially itchy to feel new things, to shed my skin and grow. I couldn't explain myself to anyone because I was only full of excited urges and notions and desires, kind of like the hawk before he transforms. Plus, I had a strong sense that I needed to snap off my past in order to have a future. All year I had worked hard to keep myself together. I held my job, managed my own money, kept passing grades, and stayed out of deep trouble. But now my accomplishments just seemed like survival routines, and I wanted to move on to more romantic turf and find out who I was and what might happen to me when the rubber met the road. And of course, I wanted to write. I figured if I crisscrossed Florida from coast to coast as if I were tying up the laces on a high-top sneaker, I would eventually stumble on something juicy to write about. I was full of hope. I had been reading constantly. I kept up my daily journal writing routine, logging my favorite quotes and building my vocabulary, and now it was time for me to stop being a chippy high school writer and to challenge myself. So I began to shut down the Bad Attitude Clearinghouse. I gave away all my thrift shop furnishings to whoever would take them. I gave my suit and jacket and striped shirts and club ties and wingtips to a young guy who was looking for work. I kept my t-shirts and jeans and sneakers. I rounded up the little kids and passed out all my candy stash, which they gleefully devoured. They didn't save one piece for later, and as I watched them prance and dance around the parking lot like sugared up puppets, I told myself to stop rationing pleasure as if it were a paycheck. It was time to cut loose and have fun and not worry about tomorrow. I wanted my candy too. Reading on the road, I felt more like Sal Paradise than Dean Moriarty. Sal was in love with everything and everybody. His eyes were as wide open as his heart. He recorded what he saw and what he felt in equal amounts, as if he were balancing the great scales of observation and reflection. But Dean confused me. He just wanted to consume everything. He had to keep moving like a shark, and in the end, he was a tragic ghost of a person, instead of a stream of Milky Way jazz under open highways. I wanted to move like Dean, but I wanted Sal's heart and soul. Unlike Sal and Dean, I didn't have years to string out a trip. I had just over 2 weeks for a mini on-the-road adventure. I knew I was going to join my family in St. Croix, but first, I figured I'd drive up to Jacksonville, see Stephen Crane's house, then work my way down the state to Key West and Hemingway's home, and finally drive back to Miami to ship the car. That was all the structure I wanted. As Kerouac wrote, I was a young writer and I wanted to take off. Somewhere along the line I knew there'd be girls, visions, everything. Somewhere along the line the pearl would be handed to me. I wanted that pearl. So there we have it, the first read. So we're going to give you an opportunity now to just talk through the what. What did you observe? What did you notice? You can use the questions that are on the slide, or you can come up with your own observations if you'd like to. What we'd ask for you to do is, after you've been talking for a while, just jot some notes down on your sheet and let us know what it is that you observed. Remember, keep in mind, you're kind of trying to uncover something here, and right now we're just starting with that. What's the text say? So use those questions, come up with your own, we'll give you some time, and then we'll read it for the second time to get to know the text a little bit better. All right, very good. So there's our first read. What did you talk about? Maybe you discussed the importance of on the road. Certainly that came up several times throughout the text. He repeated it, and that would have helped you realize this is an important idea. Maybe you realize that he's talking through this idea of wanting to leave something behind and go on a bit of an adventure, on a bit of a journey. And maybe you understand that he's leaving behind, in some ways, childhood, and he's going on this journey of development and this journey toward manhood. Maybe you saw that he's talking through planning a trip, and you notice that he's planning this trip down through Florida, and you notice that he's visiting and really mentions a lot about authors, and so you understand that the character, or Jack Antos, the narrator, is very influenced by his reading that he's done, and you know how this ties in to that entire passage. And so you talk through this idea of journey and leaving childhood, and you talk through this idea of using literature as kind of the frame for him. And if you did most of those, as you talk through most of those, you did a really nice job on your first close read. Now we're going to read the text again, and as we mentioned before, this read is more about looking at the how. So we want you to look through the way the paragraphs are organized, the way the sentences are put together, and even and specifically the words the authors use. And so we're going to ask you to pay attention to what we call diction, word choice, and syntax, structure. We've included some questions here for you to take a look at. And again, just like last time, these are just suggestions, but they are a little bit more analytical in nature. And again, they're asking you to talk about how did the author do the what? How did he make meaning of the what, which you just discussed? Now this time, you're going to read it on your own. I know some of you are going to be tempted to say, no, we don't need to read it again. We already understand. We're not just asking you to understand, though. We're asking you now to dig and to appreciate and to, again, to read closely and to develop a deeper relationship with this text. Okay, so we're going to give you some time now. Work with some small group to read the passage, talking through these questions, and jotting down some notes on your sheet. So, all right, this time, again, after our second read, we were looking at how did the author create this meaning? How did he tell us what was important? And we're really going to need to look closely at the text as we talk about this, and so we'll work through some of it together. Maybe you noticed quite a few similes. Remember, similes are part of the big five that we look for when we're reading literature. The big five, we could think about simile, metaphor, personification, hyperbole, and symbol. And really, folks, if you would just learn those, you'd be doing very well when you read literature, really all the way through college. But we saw a lot of similes in this text, and so let's just take a look at a few. Maybe you saw there on page 39, the first paragraph, him saying he kind of felt like the hawk before he transforms. And maybe you talk through this idea of before he transforms, the hawk is kind of this skinny or scrawnier person, and then he becomes this almost monster. And then kind of reinforcing the idea that Jack Gantos feels like he's just a little kid, and he wants to kind of break out of that and become this big man that he kind of sees himself as being. Maybe you looked at him talking about passing out the candy to the children, and you see him saying that he watched them prance and dance around the parking lot like sugared up puppets. And you see him comparing the children to puppets who are sugared up. And we see that idea of being a puppet. If you think about a puppet, someone who's on a string, someone who's being controlled, right? Someone who's under someone else's authority. And that fits back to the main idea of what he's trying to discuss, because he doesn't want to be a puppet. He wants to be a pearl, unique, on his own adventure. And so he's seeing himself not as these children anymore, as a child, but as an adult, as a hawk, as someone who's changing and coming out. So let's leave the similes for a while, and maybe you noticed some of the really loaded language or the really emotional language there, and because we always want to look at that. All right, so if we look at some of these repeated words, you might notice him constantly repeating, or at least frequently repeating, on the road. And so you would have taken a time to say, well, let's look at that title. Maybe you would have even said, well, how does that represent this idea of a journey? How does this represent his whole explanation of what it is that he wants? He wants to go on the road, and he wants to use some of the models that he's seen in these books to take his own journey. So you saw the repetition, and you knew that something was important there. Maybe you saw the repetition of the idea of I wanted. And isn't that the whole key of this passage, is what does Jack want? What does he want for himself? What does he want out of life? What does he want to become? How does he want to use writing to help him become those pieces? And so that repetition there gave us insight into where we're going. Maybe you looked at just the loaded words, right? Those words that have a strong emotional connotation or a strong feeling as far as just being very weighty with meaning and weighty with emotion. So maybe you see this example here when he says, I told myself to stop rationing pleasure as if it were a paycheck. And we would really look at the word rationing there. So if we have to ration because there's something missing. And so there's a limited supply. And so to ration pleasure as if it were a paycheck helps us, not only is that an extra simile there for us to pay attention to, but it helps us understand that he's not wanting to be greedy or sparse with his enjoyment of life. He's not wanting to just be simple or to be uneventful, but he wants to have a full adventure, a full life. And remember, he's talked about finding his pearl. Maybe you wanted to look at a word in context and you wanted to say, you know what? You see him saying the word romantic when he says, and I wanted to move on to more romantic turf and find out who I was and what might happen. And some of you might go to this place of saying he wants romance, he wants a relationship with someone, and we'd have to be careful there because that doesn't seem to fit the context. So as you read for context, you'd realize he's talking about this idea of adventure and this idea of becoming the best person he can be. This idea of romantic as being idealistic. This idea of being a dreamer and able to overcome the world, which is a romantic notion. It doesn't have anything to do with love and all of that. It has to do with I can conquer, and I see myself in this perfect, almost like a prince, like a warrior, like a conqueror, that kind of romance. And so maybe as you looked at the context around romantic, you realized he's talking about dreaming, not about necessarily falling in love. And there's probably a ton more that you discussed, and we're glad that you did. Those are just a few examples of what you may have looked at while you were doing your second read. What I really want to point out there, though, is we don't want you just to find the example. We don't want you just to say, well, here's this word, what's it mean in context? Or, hey, I found a simile. We're glad you can do that. But we always want you to go back to saying, how does this make the meaning? How does this relate to the main idea? How does this relate to what the author's trying to communicate? It's good to be able to find the device. It's better to be able to explain, again, the how. How does it work to make the meaning? So we'll keep that challenge there for you, and we'll encourage you to keep practicing this. But good job on that second read. You've made it through 2 reads. We have 1 more to go. And again, this one, as kind of makes sense, is going to be the deepest read. This is kind of that so what moment, where you get to make deeper meaning than just understanding it. You get to kind of make meaning of it and extend it beyond just this moment and this particular text. So here are some questions that you will want to think through when you're reading it for the 3rd time. You'll see that these are asking you to think about words like theme, and we've got that defined for you if you forget what theme is or you need a little refresher. And you also see that we're asking you to kind of analyze how the passage and how the text builds upon itself. We also are trying to give you the opportunity to do some judgment, some criticizing even, and some evaluation, right? Good readers read critically. And so we're giving you the chance to say, which one of these ideas are most persuasive, or least persuasive, or most compelling, or most supportive, or least compelling and supportive to make his point. So this is the chance for you to start to even think of yourselves as writers and as authors, and even to think about, what would I have done differently? What do I appreciate that he did? And to think about how this particular work of art connects with ideas and other works of art that you may have studied in the past. Okay, so you'll read it 1 more time, and I know, again, some of you are going to think, not a 3rd time, but really, you'll see something more, I promise. You'll see something that you didn't see the last time. So keep these questions in mind. Give it a 3rd read. Maybe ask your shoulder partner to read it this time, or someone else in your group. Or if there's someone who loves to read out loud, let that person do it again. That's fine. Give it a 3rd read. Think through these questions. Have another discussion. Jot down some thoughts. And we'll be back together in just a few moments. Okay, so you've read it for the third time and you've had this conversation about the why and the so what. So you've probably looked at some of those themes and you've looked at connections and you've looked at even evaluating, wow, is that the best example he could have given there? Or I like that example because, and that's great. As I was reading through this passage, I thought of, and I'm going to go to Gatsby because I love to go to Gatsby when I can, this idea of I wanted that pearl. And I thought through that idea of Gatsby reaching out for his green light, right? He's reaching across the Courtesy Bay and he's reaching for all of that green light represents. He's reaching for Daisy, but he's reaching for more. He's reaching for contentment and fullness and happiness, which is the same exact thing Jack's reaching for. He wants to leave this place and go and discover his true self. And so one of the themes that we may have seen there is this idea of the power of discontent to shape our future, right? We may have seen the idea of the power of dreams over our actions. Maybe you talked through that. Maybe you connected it to Gatsby like I did, or maybe you connected it to Looking for Alaska, where the author is not looking for his pearl, but his great perhaps. So maybe you just sat and wondered, why do so many texts that we've read, or why does literature or even art kind of explore this idea of a journey, leaving childhood and becoming an adult? And you saw in there yourself. Juniors and seniors especially, you're getting ready to take a journey. You're getting ready to take that next step. And so maybe as you read really carefully, you said, when Jack says this, that he feels like this, because remember, we kept it text-based, you said, I can identify with that. And I feel the same way. And so you made that connection. Or maybe you said, well, I know what he's expressing, but I don't love the way he explained it. I actually feel this way about my journey. But you see how now we've made these connections to what we've read. We've made these connections to our own experiences. We've critiqued the text a little bit. We've looked for themes. What is the purpose of all this? The so what is, I understand more about myself when I read about someone else's story. And that's one of the great gifts that literature gives us. So lots more that we could have talked about with the third read. Plenty of other places for us to critique and evaluate and connect and extend. But those are just some examples that you may have discussed as you gave it that third close read. So there you go. You've practiced close reading. And again, just to review what you've done, observing, interpreting, and applying or asking questions when we read, or thinking about what, how, and why or so what. So again, thanks very much for your participation. And if you have any questions as you practice this and as you try it out in your classes, or even as you're working on your homework, if you want to give it a try, you need some extra help, feel free to come see me. I'm in D229, or really just ask any one of your teachers throughout the building. I know that person will be very happy to help you. Have a great morning.